All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing, but of course, in fiqh of marriage, there's a lot always to say. But last time we talked about a number of different things, and we were basically going into the segment of, okay, after talking about marriage contracts and those different details of, let's call it the pragmatic side of marriage. Now we're talking about the practical side of marriage, which is how to make our homes or our houses as homes. So we talked about romance between husband and wife in Islam and what it's based on. And we also talked about, well, how to channel that definition of marriage in Islam, which is one, we're talking about commitment, we're talking about channel it towards longevity, we're talking about making that commitment where there's the basis on principle and eschewing the different selfishness from being, let's say, the center that controls the relationship. We also talked about the description, and this is where we left off at. Let's see the descriptions right there. So we were basically leaving off at that one since we talked about men, and we said, well, what you need to look for in a man is, number one, is the akhlaq. And we said the akhlaq are basically the inner principles, the inner morality of the person. But of course, it's not like we're going to be somehow going inside the person and saying, okay, or is this person greedy? Is this person, nice, hospitable, whatever it is. But we said the way to experiment that and the way to detect it is basically looking at that person's behavior. So when we say looking at that person's behavior, we said, well, there's no way that you can look into the future, but your past, or sorry, that person's past, not yours, but that person's past is your window to looking to, I guess, screening and scrutinizing and seeing what their future is going to look like. Because we basically would continue the past that we grew up in, the past that we had cultivated, the past that we had pretty much disciplined ourselves into. So therefore, we would need to look into that background check and take that seriously and see how they relate to their sisters, how they relate to their mothers. And the reason why we're going to be focusing on sisters and mothers, because certainly we're talking about female mindset, we're talking about female psychology. So if this boy is not capable, or this man is incapable of dealing with his sisters, with his mother, or with his aunt, etc., then there's a very high chance that he's not going to be able to deal with you as a wife either, because it's a mindset. Are they equipped? Are they trained enough to deal with these mindsets, the female mindset, and how are they going to relate to that? So in other words, when we look at al-akhlaq, so what we're looking for is basically al-akhlaq, and also number two, which is ad-din. So when we're looking at deen, we're looking at that person's commitment to, number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the relationship between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're talking about that commitment in terms of religion, in terms of spirituality, in terms of the pillars of Islam, and of course, the other part, which basically is the commitment in, you would see, on their body as well. So how are they committed in preserving their body? How are they committed in preserving their mind, in preserving, of course, their education, preserving their scope in what they basically learn, how to live up to the responsibility that they're supposed to be holding. Are they committed? Will they continue to be committed, or do they quit fast? If they're fast quitters, this is a red flag that this person might also quit fast even on this marriage. Because if a person is a fast quitter in school, fast quitter in jobs, fast quitter in relationships, fast quitter in the society around them, etc., then there's a red flag that this person had not learned to hold on to patience and hold on to that pain and endurance in order to get to the top of what they need to get to. So what you see in manhood, it's very important to keep that reminder when we're going to talk about manhood. What makes a man, number one, is really that commitment. What makes you feel secure as a female is basically when that person is stable in the decision making, in the steps in his life, has the stamina, has the perseverance, has the grit to basically get to the goal and reach the purpose that they had wanted. And that's definitely the most important thing that you would want in a man in terms of akhlaq. We also, or to other akhlaq that are in men perhaps the most dangerous. And we talked about being stingy and selfish, self-centricity. And we also talked about that forbearance, and we talked about those two areas. And we said for forbearance, it basically shows that that person has that patience to basically live up to not only the purpose, but live up to the principle. And this is extremely important. Live up to the principle, even when others are probably maybe provoking them, or perhaps maybe different things may all of a sudden rise, and they're capable of losing their akhlaq because there's no power to put them into akhlaq. That's the most dangerous person. That's the most dangerous person. If the only way to keep them to live within the realm of akhlaq is when there is some danger, when there is some authority to put them on akhlaq, but then the second that there's no supervision, the second that there is no accountability, at least in this dunya, and the second that they get to be the ones in authority, and that's when they lose all their akhlaq, and they feel that, you know what, I'm not going to get accountable for this, so then therefore I could just do whatever I want. That's when hypocrisy and certainly that narcissism, that toxic, that shaitan comes in. Those are the most dangerous personalities. When there's no accountability, that's when they would, or let's say even as a child, especially when they're teenagers, right there, when they're teenagers, okay, now they're stronger than their mother or their father, or perhaps maybe right now they have a job, or they might get some power. We're speaking about perhaps maybe have a phone, or perhaps maybe drive, or maybe have their own spaces or their own privileges given to them, but then they misuse it because they recognize that parents' power because they don't recognize that once that, or what they see is that once that power is incapable of putting them on the line with what they should be doing, in other words, holding them accountable, that's when they find different ways to basically sneak out and basically get out of that principle. So whether it's teenagers, this is, you know, as a teenager, perhaps you could see it clearly, but then when they grow older, it's the same concept. It's the same idea. Since I don't have a certain power to mentor, to hold me accountable for my actions, then that's when they will take advantage of that woman that is basically perhaps under their authority, or the children, or etc. Those are the most dangerous people. So when we say a person of principle, we're talking about a person of commitment, even when there's no accountability, when there's no authority, when there's no higher power to oversee their commitment. So when it's a person of principle, they will maintain the principle, they will maintain their akhlaq, they will maintain their own accountability. And that's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when talking about men, that's why you would see those different ayat basically emphasizing that what true manhood really is it's basically when they would be committed, whether رجال لا تلهيهم تجارة ولا بيع عن ذكر الله. So men, the true men, are the men that would not be pacified away from their principle, away from their prayer, away from their commitment, whether it was money being available or whether it's entertainment, no matter what it is, but they're actually committed to it, despite all the different distractions that might actually be there, or even their own drives, seeing that no one's going to be capable of putting me and holding me accountable. So when you look at the ayat, when it says رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ, we're actually going to get to later on, we're going to get to talking about that later down the road, about, well, what is masculinity, what makes a man, what makes a woman, etc., based on the definition of Quran and not based on the definition that perhaps might be influenced and biased based on a certain culture. So when we see these areas, we basically see manhood through the lens of Quran, and therefore to know what to look for in a man, you really have to see what the Quran had told you what a man is supposed to be, what a man is supposed to look like, what to look for in a man in order to basically consider al-akhlaq. So when we say what to look for in a man, we're talking about those akhlaq. What is that khuluq? What is that mannerism that I need to look for in a man? Because definitely you don't want your marriage to feel like it's basically walking on one side and the other side is basically lame. So this is extremely important. Now, in terms of, well, of course, we're not going to just talk about men. We're also going to talk about women. So what does the Prophet ﷺ or Islam describe women as? Well, of course, it's basically for you to know what to strive to become in order to be the right woman for the right man in terms of that relationship. Basically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, number one, فَالصَّالِحَاتُ قَانِتَاتٌ حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ. بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ. So, فَالصَّالِحَات, as for the pious women, they are qanitat. Now, the word qanita, al-qunut is a form of some commitment to spirituality. But when you talk about al-qunut could also be a form of khushu'. So they're what? A form of khushu', meaning a form of fear or a form of giving respect, or what is it? Now that's why when you look at this portion of that ayah right there, qanitat hafidhatun lil-ghaybi bima hafidhallah. Scholars actually had differences of opinions whether this qanita, she is qanita to her husband, or whether she is qanita to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the word qanit, if it were in the context of she is qanita to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that would mean she is having taqwa, to be committed to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But isn't that what the word salihah basically means? Well, that's why other scholars, they said, well, qanita is not referring to that she is qanita towards the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because that's what the word salihah basically would mean, which is basically right there. So they said qanita, the scholars that were saying that qanita actually here is referring to giving honor to the husband, to giving appreciation, to being committed to the husband. They basically said, well, it wouldn't make sense to repeat the same meaning and to repeat a same word within the same sentence. So they say qanita to the husband. Hafidhatun lil ghaib. What is a hafidha lil ghaib? Al-hafidha basically memorizes, but this isn't talking about memory in terms of, you know, what you keep in as stored data in your brain. But hafidhatun lil ghaib basically means that they preserve the ghaib, the things that are unseen. This isn't talking about hafidhat al-ghaib, yeah, the names of the malaika are Israfil, Mikael, and no, this isn't talking about this kind of, yeah, she memorized her lesson well. But hafidhat al-ghaib in terms of the context that it is talking about is that she learned how to preserve family privacies, to preserve her husband's privacies from it being public information. Why is that at all important? Because it is more common that women, out of perhaps they just want to ventilate, they feel good to talk about, or sometimes they just feel good to share their pains and talk to their girlfriends and talk about different things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is emphasizing this because girls basically speak and share more about their own privacies, or perhaps about their husbands, or about perhaps what happens in their home. Whether they're girls, they're going to be sharing about what happened with their siblings, with their father, with their mother, etc., basically sharing it in school. Or whether it's a girl or a woman, basically sharing about her husband to her family, and sharing whether the mistakes that he basically had done, or whether the disagreements, or whether just different things that happened between her and her husband, goes and shares it with her mother, or goes and shares it with her father, or with her siblings, or with her girlfriends, or whatever it is. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized that a pious woman learns and is basically committed to preserving the home privacies. That includes her kids, that includes her husband, and therefore is basically committed to living up to this principle and preserving all that from being public information. Because the second that the home information becomes public information, that basically puts the home in place of danger from, let's consider it, intruders. And what we mean by intruders, not necessarily somebody breaking into the house to steal your items and belongings, or valuables, or whatever it is, but this is actually talking about other people intruding within the home, whether it's talking to the children to basically stand against their parents, or whether it's talking to the husband and basically or even talking to the wife to go against her husband, and the husband basically to go against his wife. And that puts in other, let's call them individuals, getting involved within the household. And that basically expands the area of other people getting involved within this family relation, and certainly putting this home and this family at risk of other intruders in influencing the different individuals basically within that home. This is extremely important. Extremely important. So we're seeing right now, especially with, with this culture of therapists being the ones to be trusted, and the therapists right now acting as the new gurus, the new shuyukh, or the new, let's call them the religious advisors, basically taking over that area. And I used to get a lot of people basically telling me, hey, my therapist said that I'm supposed to be leaving my mother because she's toxic. And I would say, well, that's not what the deen says. But my therapist said, I would say, wait a minute, your therapist needs therapy. Your therapist needs therapy right there. This is absolutely contradicting the deen of Islam. There's nowhere that Islam would allow that somehow, because a therapist basically had seen that, yes, this mother is toxic or whatever it is, that you can basically separate yourself from your mother, your father, etc. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَصَاحِبُهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا. صاحبهما في الدنيا معروفة. That's what Islam tells you. Even if they were probably, is it possible that parents can be toxic? Oh, you better believe it. It is possible. Can some parents actually be really narcissist? Oh, yes, this is very possible. Absolutely. Wasn't Prophet Ibrahim's father narcissist? Oh, definitely. You can put him on the narcissist area. There's no question. In fact, he was willing. In fact, he really did apply it, and he put his own son Ibrahim alayhi salam into and threw him into the fire. Was he a narcissist? Oh, this is probably the highest level of narcissism. You either believe in what I'm believing in, or you're going to be thrown into the fire. You're basically right there going to be punished in the most brutal way and throwing you into the fire. So there's no question that is possible. But still, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَصَاحِبُهُمَا فِي الدُّنْيَا مَعْرُوفًا. All right, so when you look at حَافِظَاتٌ لِلْغَيْبِ بِمَا حَفِظَ اللَّهِ, this is in order to help us understand how to live that discipline as women, to learn how not to share your home privacies and make them public privacies. Even if you wanted to ask a fatwa, even if you wanted to call a sheikh or whatever it is, be as anonymous as possible. If your sheikh knows your voice, you know what, call a different sheikh. Be as anonymous as possible, preserving your privacies, whether we are talking to a therapist or whether you're talking to a sheikh or no matter who it is. Preserving your privacies gives you honor. It gives you honor. It maintains your honor. And certainly the best way to assure confidentiality is by you learning how to keep things confidential. If you fail to keep things confidential, then just know that the only way to catch a fish is when it opens its mouth. If you were to throw a bait and then try to fish, you would not be capable of catching any fish unless that fish believed that this is food. It opens its mouth and boom, that's when you're capable of catching that fish. That's the only time. And just keep that one in mind. You want to preserve your home. You want to preserve yourself. Learn how to keep your matters confidential. Learn how to preserve your privacies. And if you needed to basically get the advice, learn how to stay as anonymous as possible. So when you look at حافظات للغيب, it's basically something that you would train your young girls and your young daughters to learn how to not share, whether it's privacies that they know about their brothers or privacies that they know about what's happening at home, etc. Teach them how to stay quiet and not share home privacies, and that this is certainly a big deal. Okay. خير النساء التي إذا أعطيت شكرت وإذا حرمت صبرت تسرك إذا نظرت وتطيعك إذا أمرت. So this is the Prophet basically right there, this hadith right there. So you look at the Prophet was asked, أي النساء خير, which are the best women? And the Prophet said, التي تسره إذا نظر إليها وتطيعه إذا أمر ولا تخالفه في نفسها ولا في ماله بما يكره. You can see this hadith is basically a Sahih hadith. When he was asked, which are the best women? He said, it's basically the woman that when he sees her, she basically brings happiness into his heart. He sees her, whether she's looking good or whether she is basically a happy and a cheerful person. And this is something that is very common that we would find in women, in which is very similar to another hadith when the Prophet ﷺ had said, رَأَيْتُكُنَّ أَكْثَرَ أَهْلِ النَّارِ, I had seen majority of you in hellfire. I know I repeat this hadith very, very, very often because this hadith explains a lot from what I had seen as one of the biggest breakers in marital relations is basically these two personalities. تكثرن اللعن وتكفرن العشير. Basically the women that are continuously complaining about everything. If she's not married, she's continuously complaining about her mother, about her siblings, about her father, about how she's basically just living the most desperate life, and how her life is just nothing but sorrow, nothing but pain, nothing but this and this. And especially in a society that feeds the mindset of victimhood, this basically comes in feeding a lot of women to not be appreciative. So when you look at that tukthirna la'n, it comes in a lot of women. And when they get married, she's basically complaining and comparing herself with other women who probably, especially in the age of social media, those women might be sharing that she went out with her husband, probably, I don't know, to this or that country, and putting on social media, and everybody's liking and all of that, and not realizing that just minutes before this picture or after this picture, they basically went into a heated argument, or probably even went really far. And certainly when you look at those fake images and fake videos that are on social media, this definitely can influence a lot of women out there into seeing some aesthetic relationship and not necessarily the core of that relationship and what really matters in the relationship and how stable we're looking into those relationships. Now, when we speak about that other hadith, تكثرن تكفرن العشير. تكفرن العشير, I know I didn't write it right there, but I should have actually put it along. But تكفرن العشير is when they would deny any contribution, or basically deny whenever somebody does good to them. They'll basically forget all the good. And here's one thing. There's actually a biological reason to that. So women are more susceptible to depression for a number of different reasons. Part of that is basically the different hormones, whether it's during pregnancy or whether it's during menstrual cycle, and of course those hormonal changes can affect a woman's ability to stay in, let's call it, in that happy mood. There's definitely a biological reason, but the biological reason is not to justify, but that's basically to let us know. So being aware of it, and even during menopause, being aware of it is one way to solve it and recognize that this exists. And the Prophet ﷺ was letting us know that we are more susceptible to this kind of depression. We're more susceptible to getting these cortisol and this kind of mood swing and this kind of a behavior where we are not seeing the side where the cup is full, but we're looking at the empty space of it. So the Prophet ﷺ was teaching us in that hadith how to recognize the good, how to recognize all those things that are basically presented to you, or always say, well, look at what you have and don't always look at what's missing. So here the sister is saying something. Let's see what she's saying. If a woman is working with a platform as a city coordinator, she needs to share some personal info. Then how can she remain anonymous? So that's her homework to work on. Okay. So even if you are a city coordinator, I'm not talking about I'm not talking about being anonymous in, okay, here I am, I'm a city coordinator, everybody knows, this, I don't know, Dr. X or Y or Z. I'm not saying anonymous where no one knows your name. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being anonymous in terms of the dynamics that happen at home. There are some problems between you and your siblings, or problems that are probably disagreements between you and your in-laws, or problems between you and your husband, or whatever it is. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about who and what your name is, okay? I'm not saying that it is not permissible for men to know your name. Okay, my name is out there. Everybody knows my name. There's nothing wrong with that. We know Sayyidah Aisha's name. We know the Sahabiyat's name. In fact, we've got it right there. الإصابة في تمييز الصحابة. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani had a whole volume on all the women Sahaba right there. So this isn't haram to know their names, okay? But I'm talking about when you're working as a city coordinator, okay, or you're probably a school teacher or a principal, then the area that involves your public dynamic is completely different than the area that involves your personal dynamic. So, for example, you studied at this school, you graduated with this degree, this is what you have experience in. This relates to that public position. But matters that perhaps don't relate to any of that, your children, their names, and your husband, and how much money you're making, and what kind of a job, and what kind of a, where your address is, or how much your rent is, and all of that, and how you and your husband are not getting along on certain issues. That is not public information. That is your personal information. Maintain it. Do not make that public, because the second you make it public, you become accessible to other people to get involved within your home. That's what I'm talking about. But the things that relate to public work, your job, your experience, etc., that's related to public platform. That's a completely different. So we have to learn how to separate between these two, or else other people will also confuse those. And when you're a public figure and you start becoming too public, even on your personal matters, then there's no question that you're going to find yourself as basically other people's property. It's really what you shared about yourself. You made yourself public property when you shared your personal matters and made them become public property. So in other words, if you want to maintain yourself from being public property, learn how to not make yourself as basically accessible to others. So let's continue the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, التي تسره إذا نظر إليها. So the Prophet ﷺ was basically talking about the importance of appearance, how you appear in front of your husband, how you appear, whether in dressing up for, of course, for whether it's a private moment, or whether it's, just giving him that respect. And that goes with that qanitat. Remember that one. That goes with qanitat, and with qanitat, giving honor to the husband. Giving honor to the husband is part of making him feel his masculinity. You want the man to treat you like a woman, you show him that you honor him as a man. It goes both ways. You want him to treat you like a woman, treat him like a man. And the same thing if it's a man. I would say, treat her like a woman and she will treat you like a man. Give her the respect as a woman, and she will, in return, respect you as a man. So in other words, certainly goes both ways. And that's one thing, is that we basically have to recognize those marital tips. The Prophet ﷺ basically gave us these marital tips, and that's why he said, وَتُطِيعُهُ إِذَا أَمَرَ. She would obey him when he gives a commandment. Well, wait a minute. So a couple of things here. تُطِيعُ. Isn't that a condescending word when you say تُطِيعُهُ إِذَا أَمَرَ? Isn't that condescending to basically ask women to obey their husbands? Doesn't that sound like slavery? The answer is no, it doesn't sound like slavery. But the feminism, ideology wanted to get these women outside of their homes, and in order to basically get the women into this working platform and working arena, they basically had convinced them that, you know what, in order to be a free, quote unquote, an independent, quote unquote, woman, the only way to guarantee that you're going to be gaining that independence, that freedom, is basically by having your own separate income, your own separate money. And that way you can guarantee that you will be somehow independent, you will be given the respect that you deserve, etc. But then Islam comes in and tells you, well, wait a minute, when we're talking about right there, there's that home that is a priority. Okay, you can work where, you know, we don't disagree on that. But then when you look at تطيعه إذا أمر, at the end, when she's going to get a job, she's going to obey basically her boss, which could be a man. But they didn't have a problem with obeying the boss, because to them, money is our place of obedience, not home. The priority to a feminist agenda and a feminist ideology is, well, it's the whole issue of making money and making women basically be another area of being taxpayers, basically making money and basically getting them into this kind of a capitalist race. So that's one thing, is that they didn't have a problem with, yes, obeying the boss, even if he's a man. But they had a big problem with this. But they had a very big problem when it came to obeying the husband, and that's when they used this type of stereotypical image on the word obedience there. And they said, well, no, we can't have that. We cannot have a woman obeying her husband. That sounds very condescending. That sounds very misogynist. And that sounds like the husband is somehow in a position of a hierarchy in comparison with the woman. But the Prophet ﷺ made it clear that it is part of being within the household institution, that the husband is basically the one to be in the position, whether you want to call it authority or you want to call it responsibility, you want to call it a position of being in power. At the end of the day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called him al-Qawwam, الرجال قوامون على النساء, which basically does contain within that word the word qawwam, whether it's responsibility, there's an inference of responsibility, there's an inference of power, there's an inference of certainly a position of hierarchy. There's no question about that. And like I said, it's not an issue of being a misogynist, but we're looking deep into the words and what they contain. I know that if you were to go to the translations for the Quran, they might use different ways in order to translate this word, in order to cut corners on a lot of the stereotypical images right there, and basically respond and refute the stereotypical images. But I'll tell you that actually in the ayat, some of these ayat do really give the inference that certainly that there is somewhat of looking at it like a triangle. Like this triangle, you've got one point, and then you basically would have different areas within this triangle. Same thing, that there is a certain triangle, there's a certain tip at that triangle, there's a certain responsibility. This is not at all to say that women are inferior whatsoever, because the ayah was really clear, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, that the best of you in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the most pious, regardless, male, female, that has nothing to do with that. But we're same thing in another ayah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يَعْمَلْ صَالِحًا مِّن ذَكَرٍ أَوْ أُنثَىٰ فَنُحْيِيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبَةً. Whoever does good, whether male or female, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically promises to revive them in a good life, whether we're speaking about this dunya or whether we're speaking about the akhirah. So there's no question that Islam does not whatsoever have any biases, between male and female, but that is not to put us in the dichotomy and make us think that, yeah, well, if it's giving us that type of position within the marital institution, that yes, the husband needs to be holding at least the top of that position, the responsibility, and certainly be the person that is in the highest level of responsibility, highest level of order and law enforcement and all of that. But then that is not to confuse it as tashrif, but it is taklif. It's responsibility and certainly not necessarily a level of honor. But at the same time, when you look at the word qanitat, which basically is in this ayah, and you see the word tuti'uhu idha amar, it does give us an inference. And if you scrutinize this word, and this is what we need to do, is basically study male psychology and study female psychology through the words themselves in the hadith. So when you look at tuti'uhu idha amar, what do I understand here? No, I'm trying to go deep, think of it as you're going behind the stage. When you say she obeys him when he orders or when he commands, what is that supposed to mean? That it is part of a man's psychology, part of the boy's psychology, and part of what will make a stable home is that a man needs to feel, and it is part of his psychology, that he needs to feel that he is the one in control, that he's the one basically in responsibility, he's the one accountable for whatever he's doing. And he will take his matter seriously. At the same time, let's look at it from the different corner, that it is part of a woman's psychology for her to feel that she's secure, that for her to feel that there is a position of manhood, because a woman is always in search of a man, which basically means a man that is capable of being secure, a man that is capable of giving basically, let's say this home to be in a place of harmony, to be in a place where everything is basically taken care of by him, and I don't have to worry about taking care of everything. He'll basically be doing all the numbers and all those calculations. I'll basically just be doing the other things, because my hands are already full. My hands are already busy doing other things. And if he were to get involved in those other things, he'll definitely mess up. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was letting me know that he was built for one thing and you were built for another thing. And this is not to say any is superior or any is inferior, but this is to say you complete each other. So therefore, in order to complete one another, he basically needs to be in the position of accountability, in the position of responsibility, in the position of authority, and at the same time, that position requires this type of a harmony that you, on the other hand, would obey. Because the second that whether any government, any institution, the second that the different classes or the different groups within this company, within this institution, are going to start disobeying the commands that the CEO, that the principal, that the person that's basically managing everything, the second that the ones, let's call them the executive classes are going against the director, that's when this whole institution will start falling. So Islam tells us, well, wait a minute, no, we need to emphasize for the rest of the different classes, and in this situation, basically the woman, that I want you, in order to keep this marriage intact, to make this institution basically working towards a certain goal, I want you to consider that obedience to the command is a religious duty. It's a religious duty. It's exactly like you're obeying Allah Almighty. It's a religious duty in order to make sure that we have this family basically going towards that sukoon. Remember, the whole reason for all of this is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted this institution to be litaskunu ilayha, in order to get to that position of stability, that position of harmony, that position of basically peace. Okay, so let's continue right there. ولا تخالفه في نفسها ولا في ماله بما يكره. That she would not, the word is تخالفه. What does تخالفه mean? So تخالف can mean, one, object. Two, it could also mean to basically go in somewhat of a, some kind of a revolution. So when you say لا تخالفه, in other words, it carries with it to disrupt. So ولا تخالفه في نفسها, that she would not disrupt in her own self. In other words, she doesn't cheat behind his back. Not that cheating in front of him is permissible, but we're talking about does not cheat and does not get involved. So whether we're talking about social media, talking to these random guys, or whether we're talking, even if he would accept it, that's still haram. All right. And same thing, whether in person, etc. At the end of the day, is that لا تخالفه في نفسها. She would basically live in harmony with her husband, in herself, in her body, and certainly in the wealth as well. So does not use it in ways that is against basically his contempt. And certainly bima yakrah. I want you to look at the word bima yakrah. Bima yakrah meaning what he would hate that she would spend it in that way. So what does that mean? That means that even if he may not know what's inside that cart, that she would recognize that she has a responsibility to spend that money in the right money management, and make sure that whether we're speaking about her own self, or whether we're speaking about the money, or whether we're speaking about the space, which is the household, that she would honor and live with that transparency. And this is extremely important. We're talking, remember, we said that the worst of the worst of the descriptions that can disrupt that harmony within the relationship is lying, is the lack of transparency between the husband and the wife. Because the second that lying and sneaking gets into the way, that's when we start feeling insecure, and that's when we start to withdraw. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was teaching us right there how to not sneak, how to be transparent, whether the person is present or whether the person is absent. At the end of the day, it's all about transparency that develops later on into that security, into that harmony, and certainly into that transparency where we feel secure with one another. And having that being said, when you look at these different akhlaq, the Prophet ﷺ basically said, فَاظْفَرْ بِذَاتِ الدِّينِ تَرِبَتْ يَدَكَ. And therefore, the best thing to do is, advising the men, is look for a woman that has the best of the deen. So what does it mean that has the best of the deen? The best of the deen basically means that she is committed to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what does that look like? Committed to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the deen, in her life, in her in her mind, committed to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in her chastity and in money. That's committed to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we're going to talk about that inshallah in detail. So what does taribat yadak mean? So taribat yadak basically means if you do not commit yourself to seeking a woman of piety, all that you probably were running after in terms of beauty or in terms of progeny, perhaps, or whatever it is, eventually all of that will dissolve and all of that will wear with time. So the Prophet was telling, well, all of that will wear with time. All of that will wear with time, and therefore you need to be committed. You need to be committed and stick to what really matters the most. To what really matters the most, because everything else wears with time, whether it's beauty or whether it's money or whether it's family. It just takes time and everything's going to be gone. So the Prophet ﷺ is telling you, well, or else everything wears off and you're really left with the reality that you have this person, and what really values the most about her is that akhlaq of her, or those akhlaq of hers. Okay, so let's say right there, is the relationship a form of hierarchy or companionship? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala generally says, وَعَاشِرُهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, and be a companion to this woman, but the word is bil-ma'ruf. What is al-ma'ruf? Al-ma'ruf has two things. Number one, al-ma'ruf basically means on good terms. So good terms, honesty, good terms, commitment, good terms, transparency, good terms, respect, honor, all of that, that's good terms. That's one side of it. The other one is basically al-ma'ruf, to meaning what is known. In other words, culture plays a key role here in how we would define things like ma'ruf, what we would define rights, what we would define responsibility, etc. So looking at culture is not necessarily against the deen, but it's the deen itself is telling you that culture is part of what makes you. Culture is part of what the deen itself considered, well, this is a fact of human nature. This is a fact of what you are. This is a fact of what created your mindset, or the fact of what made your identity. So therefore, yes, we are going to take culture as a serious thing that we need to see and we need to understand, and not necessarily issue it to the side and think that it doesn't matter. Okay, let's continue. The second ayah, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and they have the rights, they have the rights exactly the way that they have the obligations to them, that is to their husbands. But the ayah basically continues, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. I should have actually completed the ayah, but I'll complete it at least right here. وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ. What does it mean, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ? In other words, it's not an equal thing. No, men are and women, according to this ayah, they're not fully equal. And yes, that the husband and the wife, they're not necessarily, equal in a sense. I gave you this amount, this much, and you gave me this much. Therefore, this is what you have to do. And this is your responsibility. The ayah says, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ. The word عَلَيْهِنَّ is letting us know that there is an extra responsibility upon women towards their husbands than the other way around. And that's why it said daraja. Okay? So what does that mean? That yes, it's not total equality. In fact, the ayah was really clear about it and saying, actually, there's more responsibility upon women towards their husbands than the husbands towards the wives. The ayah was really clear about it. It's not total equality. Let's continue right here to understand. Well, does that mean he would abuse that right? Does that mean he would abuse it and prevent me from seeing my family and prevent me, and it's like he owns me now? Absolutely not. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, خَيْرُكُمْ خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِهِ وَأَنَا خَيْرُكُمْ لِأَهْلِي. The Prophet ﷺ said, the best of you are the best to his family, that is to his wife, and I'm the best to my wife or my wives. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, Istawsu bin nisa'i khayra. Now, here's one thing. When he said, Istawsu bin nisa'i khayra, and this basically would mean the Prophet ﷺ was letting them know that you have a responsibility, speaking to the men. You have a responsibility, whether that woman was your sister, whether that woman was your mother, whether that woman was your wife. At the end, you have a responsibility to be kind, to embrace them, to preserve them, bin nisa. Because definitely they're different, their mindset is different, they're more emotional, they definitely have these mood swings that men don't have. So the Prophet ﷺ was saying, Istawsu bin nisa'i khayra. He didn't say it's women, meaning to mean wives alone, but he was also talking about their sisters. He was telling the men, hey, I want you to be good with your sisters, in other words. I want you to be good with all women. With all women. The second, that hadith basically leaves it in this comprehensive statement. That's in order to let us know that, listen, when you're talking about women, they have a completely different anatomy. So that's why he continues and says, فَإِنَّ الْمَرْأَةَ خُلِقَتْ مِنْ ضِلَعٍ. For the woman was created with a bent rib. Wait a minute, like a bent rib? Like, what do you mean a bent rib? So the Prophet ﷺ was letting us know that the female anatomy is completely different than the male anatomy. And if the male anatomy is, or the female anatomy is different, that there's the bent rib, which basically is within the chest and basically those ribs. So the Prophet ﷺ was letting us know that, well, وَإِنَّ أَعْوَجَ شَيْءٍ فِي الضِّلَعِ أَعْلَى. In fact, we know that, despite all that, that attempt to make us believe that you are female or you are male, basically just by the appearance and what actually appears externally. But we know that in your skeleton, your bone mass, your DNA could actually tell you whether you have an XY or an XX chromosome, and then therefore there's no running away. You are male or female to your DNA, basically from the making of your own cells, even before the development of any reproductive system or any of that. You're basically male and female from the very beginning. In fact, they would be capable of identifying which one is a male and which one is a female, even when they are sperms. Yes, they could see a sperm itself, this is a male, and this is going to be a female, this is going to be a male, even when they're just sperms, and they could see it under a microscope. So there's no running away. Having that being said, the Prophet ﷺ was letting us know that when you look at the word a'waj, what is the inference? What is a'waj? A'waj means bent. Is this literal or metaphorical? It's both. Literal, that yes, a woman's anatomy has a structure, whether we're talking about pelvic bones or whether we're talking about the chest bones, the ribs, or whether we're talking about just different body parts, that they have a different bone structure. And that bone structure basically affects not only bones, but in not only appearance or hip bones or whatever it is, but it also affects their mindset. It affects their psychology. It affects the way they behave. فَإِنْ ذَهَبْتَ تُقِيمُهُ كَسَرْتَ. And he said, if you would attempt to somehow flatten it and think that, yeah, I'm going to flatten this, he said, well, what you're going to do, you're going to end up breaking it. So therefore, the Prophet ﷺ is letting the men know, listen, there's a reality about a female anatomy that you just cannot expect her to be the same way as you are. So in other words, just accept her, just accept that she's built differently, that she has a completely different mindset, that she has her own behavior and her own mindset, and therefore you would have to acknowledge that she is basically in a different structure. وإن تركته لم يزل أعوج. And if you were leaving it that way, it would still be bent. In other words, you just have to accept the reality that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created their anatomy or their psychology completely different, and therefore you have to accept that she is built different, and she is built different. So the Prophet ﷺ said, فَاسْتَوْصُوا بِالنِّسَاءِ خَيْرًا. What is فَاسْتَوْصُوا? فَاسْتَوْصُوا here, the alif sin ta basically means to seek. Basically means to seek. فَاسْتَوْصُوا بِالنِّسَاءِ خَيْرًا. So therefore, you would have to seek the different methods to basically have that wasiyah. When you say wasiyah, what is al-wasiyah? Al-wasiyah is the will. We're not talking about inner will, but we're talking about that you are living up to that principle, even though you might have the drive to do otherwise. Okay, even you might have, I guess, your own self, you're so angry, you've got that drive to harm, you've got that drive to probably throw the stuff in her face and probably attack or do all of that. The Prophet said, فَاسْتَوْصُوا بِالنِّسَاءِ خَيْرًا. Don't expect them to be the same behavior or probably be in the same direction that you might consider as a man that it is right. You just have to embrace that they're more emotional. You have to embrace that they're built different. So the Prophet ﷺ said, فَاسْتَوْصُوا بِالنِّسَاءِ. All you have to do is that you have to be, as a man, don't let your power and don't let your physical power or let your own authority try to overrule whether this is your mother or whether this is your sister, or whether this is your wife. You know, today I was also preparing for, I want to show you this. You know, I want to show you this. So this is basically part of tafsir. Today, I was actually looking at this one. Okay, let me show you what that is. Okay, I want you to look at this one. I'm going to take you there, and I want you to look at this piece of it. So I was preparing the tafsir, and I came across this word right there. Hold on, let's see. Here we go. This is it. So he said, وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. He said, الإحسان إلى الوالدين برهما وحفظهما وصيانتهما وامتثال أمرهما وإزالة الرق عنهما وترك السلطنة عليهما. I want you to look at this one. Said, and towards the two parents, what it means and to be in a place of ihsan is basically to give them that respect and to preserve them and to take care of them and obeying their orders. And if they are basically izalatul riq, in other words, if they were slaves, that you would put your effort to free them. But look at this one. Tarku sultanati alayhima. What is tarku sultana? Sultana, this is not talking about some kind of a sultan, you know, that they're, you know, somehow, you know, being in a position of a khalifa. No. Tarku sultanati, sultana basically means to act in hierarchy. So in other words, you don't act as the person to be in power, but you submit to their power, and you don't attempt to basically want to prove it to them that, you know what, I'm going to show you that my orders are going to be superior to yours. My words are the ones that are going to take over. And that's why it's important to teach basically your boys, especially the boys, of course, how to fastawsu bin nisa, how to be in that commitment, how to be in that respect, whether we're speaking about mother or whether we're speaking about sister or whether we're speaking about wife in the future. This is part of Islam. Okay, let's say right there. So therefore, love in Islam is farther than lustful feelings. It's actually a commitment. It's actually honor. It's actually justice. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. He had created from your own selves pairs, أزواجا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, in order for you to basically live in that harmony. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً, and created within you that mawadda. What is al-mawadda? Al-mawadda is that love and is that affection, and mercy is basically that even though you might have the drive to resist, might have the drive to somehow probably get angry, etc., but your rahmah comes in. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, فَاسْتَوْصُوا بِالنِّسَاءِ. Why? Because she's definitely going to be weaker, because she's definitely going to be more vulnerable. So you learn that being religious basically means to be a man in a way that you recognize that this person is basically more vulnerable. So you don't practice your manhood on that woman in a way where somehow it's breaking her, but you would practice your manhood in a way to preserve her, to take care of her. That's what it means to be a man. What it means to be a man is to basically be the person of commitment, the person of care, the person of trust, the person of security. Okay, now let's look at this other set, the certain laws for fiqh of prioritization in Islam. So when we look at the principles of Sharia, all right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically had considered certain things to be the main principles in Islam. Now, what does that mean? There are certain priorities in the religion: the preservation of deen, the preservation of life, and basically these areas, the preservation of ird, and the preservation of aql, and the preservation of men. Now, scholars had differences of opinion. So when you look at, certainly it's in this order: preservation of spirituality and piety, preservation of life, preservation of chastity, and preservation of mind, preservation of wealth. All of those are basically the key things in Islam in order to consider as priorities, and certainly in this order. So in other words, preserving your deen is a key and the first thing in the religion. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically is always telling us that tawheed is the core of the religion. Number two, and then he would tell you, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا النَّفْسَ الَّتِي حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ. Then preserving human life is the second priority. Three, وَلَا يَزْنُونَ وَمَنْ يَفْعَلْ ذَلِكَ يَلْقَى أَثَامًا يُضَاعَفْ لَهُ الْعَذَابُ وَيَخْلُدْ فِيهِ مُهَانًا, and etc. So then number three is preserving chastity, whether in lowering the gaze or whether in what language you would use. And of course, especially the language of profanity is during our times is, and even the past times, is basically seen as cool. If you are to use certain words of profanity, it is basically perceived and within the society that somehow you're being an adult, you're being smart, you're being cool. But Islam tells you that preserving chastity, whether in the language or whether in what you see, or whether in your behavior, or whether in your relationship, in your social dynamic, that it should be within the area that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had asked you to preserve family. Therefore, any promiscuous or any behavior, whether it's with girls or whether it's outside of akhlaq with boys or outside of akhlaq with even oneself, whether in looking at girls or whether in talking to girls, if it's talking to a boy, or whether it's a boy talking about guys or relating with guys, or even looking at different things that are haram things, or whether it's engagement in that way, that is basically a form of zina, and therefore a direct attack on family. All right, so that's the third level of preserving chastity and certainly preserving our deen. The fourth one is preserving the mind. When we're talking about preserving the mind, whether we're speaking about using anything that may alter the mind And whether we're speaking about preserving the mind, in preserving what you know and how you practice what you know, etc., all of that, and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically taught us in terms of the preservation of mind, whether in avoiding intoxicants or whether talking about in preserving your ilm, etc. And the fifth one is basically preserving wealth, how the income is coming in and how the money is spent. And we're talking about money management and so forth. And this is basically part of the priorities in Islam. When we look at these priorities, we understand that Islam did not put all the commands on one level, but considers that some are more important, or considered more important, therefore a priority. And therefore, others are less important. And therefore, that if you had the chance to basically choose, or there are certain things that you need to perhaps maybe at the expense of something else, that's why Islam also then tells us, well, there are certain things that you need to consider as terms of guidelines for prioritization. So therefore, you would say that the scholar said, al-fara'idu awla min al-nawafil wal-mustahabbat. Obligatory actions precede recommended and liked actions. So therefore, I would consider, is this obligatory? Yes, it's good. It's good to volunteer, I guess, in maybe in senior homes, or volunteer in probably different areas. That's good. But your priority is to help your mother. It's good to volunteer outside. It's good to probably pick up trash on the streets. But your priority is within your home. It's good to go do da'wah in different countries and probably go do da'wah and tabling and all of that. But your first da'wah is towards your kids and towards your wife. That's the first thing. That's obligatory. The other one is mustahab. Okay, let's see. طلب الأعلى أولى من طلب الأدنى. Seeking high virtues precedes other less important virtues. So you're talking about, well, the higher virtue is something as, for example, higher virtue in preserving my wife's needs. Okay, so certainly your wife's needs. But then certainly you might say, well, you know, there are so many women out there that need to get married, etc. Well, first, work towards your wife. And then if you had the ability to get a second wife, by all means, go ahead, it's halal. But first, you need to be committed to what you have right now. And that's, you know, that's one thing, but that's not exclusive to that. الإخفاء في التطوعات أولى من الإظهار. Concealing rituals precedes revealing them. And that's extremely important. We're talking about rituals, same thing. That being concealing, whether the good things that you do or whether different things, learning how to conceal yourself and how not to be public property is always a priority. And the other thing, al-aqida awla bit-taqdim min al-sharia. Islamic creed precedes speaking about sharia. So in other words, is this person Muslim or not? And learning about tawheed is more important than learning fiqh. This isn't to say that learning fiqh is not important, but this is saying that, hey, the first foundation is understanding aqidah itself. And certainly the common benefit precedes the less benefit. We're not talking about common benefit. We're talking about common benefit within the household, etc. One son probably wants one thing, but we may need to use and put a policy on everybody within the household, because we need to preserve the common benefit, even if one probably needed a certain thing. So we might need to take away all the tablets, all the laptops, even though it was one person that probably misused this this gadget. but I may need to put a policy for the whole household just to make sure that we're not just targeting one person, but just to make sure that we are setting a certain policy to be respected and basically to give that authority to that policy. الأكثر مفسدة أولى بالدرء من الأقل مفسدة. Considering the bigger harm is prior to the lesser evil. So what does that mean? We're considering the bigger harm. What bigger harm? The bigger harm, of course, إذا تعارضت مفسدتان روعي أعظمهما ضررا بارتكاب أخفهما. This is a general legal maxim in Islam. So when you look at these laws that I gave you here, this isn't it. This is a whole field of study in fiqh, but I'm just giving you certain examples of how Islam does actually consider certain priorities over others, and that not everything is necessarily at the same level of virtue. There are certain things that are considered of a higher level in their virtue and their importance, and therefore it's very important to study that, because if you don't recognize what's my first priority, what's my second, what is all of these different, let's call them sciences, to recognize how to do this type of management, because hey, we've got an effort and an energy that is not unlimited. We definitely have limited time. We definitely have limited spaces. The good things, they're unlimited. So what should I consider as my priority? And there are certain 5 legal maxims. And the reason why I'm giving you all of this 1, 2, 3, basically areas. So think of it as a triangle to help us see, think of it as you're wearing, I guess, glasses, but these glasses are basically triangular, looking through these lenses. These lenses, and this is a lens right there, you're looking into, think of it, it's primary colors right there, and all of that is basically giving you, yes, certainly the primary colors, the red, orange, green, etc. All right, those colors right there, but then they basically all together would blend to basically make your color white and basically make things bright for you to be able to see. And that's the same thing. So think of these as the primary colors and think of these as basically what fits inside Sharia. When you look at Sharia, what do you see? You basically see these elements, but of course, usually people don't recognize these elements not until they're clarified to them. So not until we see through, not until we probably put the light into this prism, that it's going to be letting us see that, oh, this white color is actually a combination of a number of different colors. Not until then are we really capable of seeing that. And that's the same thing. When you look at Sharia, it's actually a combination of different, principles, legal maxims, and certain prioritizations. So you are basically right there breaking Sharia into these different elements in order to see beyond this piece of ray, which is called basically Sharia right there. Let's see the other prism, or the other primary colors, which basically are the universal maxims. So we're talking about number 1, al-umur bimaqasidiha. This is talking about the intention. The matters shall be judged by their objectives. That's the number 1 legal maxim. We're going to look at the intention before we discuss anything. Number 2, ad-darar yuzal. That the second objective of Sharia is to remove any harm, whether this harm, whether that was on your nafs, whether that was on your mental state. In other words, there's that other objective, is that we are supposed to be eliminating harm. That's another objective, and we're supposed to be maximizing good. That's the whole key, and the whole basis of Sharia is to eliminate evil and to maximize good. Let's see, the number 3, is al-'adatu muhakkima or muhakkama. Now, the difference between al-'adatu muhakkima is that al-'ada to mean culture is basically a reference that we would turn to. Yes, culture is a reference. Culture is not to be eliminated, but culture is something that we would go back to as a form of communication, as a form of experiment, as a form of reference, and therefore we would not deny culture. Muhakkama, that it basically is one area that we would use in order to judge whenever there's a dispute. We would basically look at culture. That's why many times when there is a dispute, I would say, I need you to go back in case of a dispute between you and your husband. I need you to go back to a sheikh that is from your own community, from your own culture, that understands basically the legal maxims in Islam and understands your culture, because I may not be the right person because I don't understand your culture and what a lot of these definitions or what a lot of expectations are necessary in order to bring harmony within that relationship. Number 4, al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. Hardship shall bring alleviation. So we're talking about whenever there's hardship, it's becoming too hard. Well, know that, well, we're going to probably give you certain tips to make things easier for you to be able to apply in your life, to be able to apply basically the legal maxims, basically Sharia, where if you're finding it extremely hard, we've got some tips for you to get into that discipline, to grow in your ability to basically practice, to be able to get stronger, to practice basically Islam. Number 5 is al-yaqinu la yazulu bi-shak. Certainty shall not be removed by doubt. So what does that mean? We're not going to be considering that, this might happen. No, I'm not going to say might. And there's that thing. We need to see things based on certainty and not based on what might happen, what might be presented. But we need to see al-yaqeen. We need to get to certainty. And this is very common that people would come in and basically say, well, what do you base it on? We're going to look at, is this usually leading to harm or leading to haram? Or is this often? Or is this barely leading to haram? If this is going to be most likely leading to haram, then we're going to say, well, yes, it's going to be within the area of makruh. If this is always, or at least 85% of the times, leading to harm or leading to haram, then we're going to say this is haram. We need you to quit it. And they're in that situation. And therefore, we would see these areas to help us understand our priorities, to help us understand how we understand our fiqh. Okay, so in relationship to taking care of children, dealing with basically our families, as a wife, as right now an institution in this marriage relationship, I've got a number of different responsibilities. I've got the husband, I've got the children, I've got the household. Which one should I consider first? They're all important. Everything here in front of me, whether it's the husband, the children, or the household, it's just so much on my plate that I have to consider my priorities. What is my priority? The first priority is basically the husband. That's the first priority that Islam considered. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'ul an ra'iyatihi." Each and every single one of you, you have a responsibility, and therefore you are held accountable for that responsibility. That's what the Prophet ﷺ said. Each and every single one of you, you've got a responsibility. And to accomplish the best type of completing that task within that responsibility, that's part of the deen. So the Prophet ﷺ is letting us know your accountability is basically maintaining, as a wife, these 3 areas. Number 1, the husband. Number 2, the children. And number 3 is the house. But here's one thing. When you look at all these areas, it's so much. So what should I consider first? Number one, consider first the husband. The husband is basically the first responsibility that you want to consider. Okay, so how do I consider the husband? Okay, I'll look at the husband. What about him? Well, there's one thing. In order to help you maintain this responsibility towards the husband, then you basically have to look into how Islam considered this responsibility and how Islam considered as a helpful tool for you to be able to be committed to this responsibility. Let me tell you a story. The Prophet ﷺ had a cousin. Her name was Hani. Hani was the daughter of Abu Talib. She basically had been widowed, and the Prophet ﷺ asked for her hand in marriage. But guess what? She rejected the proposal. Who would reject the Prophet ﷺ's proposal? Hani. Why did you reject his proposal? I mean, what a privilege to get married to the Prophet ﷺ and be in one of Ummahat al-Mu'mineen. She said, because I was afraid. Since I had orphans of my own, and I had the responsibility to maintain these orphans. If I were married to the Prophet ﷺ, I would definitely have my shortcomings towards the Prophet ﷺ. So I wanted to make sure that I would not put myself in a bigger responsibility more than what I can handle, especially that I already have these orphans to take care of. And certainly, if I were to have shortcomings towards the Prophet ﷺ, that's going to be a big responsibility on Judgment Day. So I'm going to have to at least recognize my ability and that I would not be capable of holding such a huge responsibility. So I have to turn in and I would have to reject basically this proposal. And she did, because she considered it was too much for her to basically bear and be accountable for on Judgment Day. So therefore, when you look at that, the first thing that you want to consider is before you even get into the marriage, and this person is going to be the leader of the household, this person is going to be the person that I'm going to be obeying, this person is going to be my leader, this person is going to be the person that is going to be the qawwam over me. Well, yes, then you really have to scrutinize, not based on a love and a romantic relationship, but based on a relationship that this is the person that I'm going to be obeying. So therefore, if he is not man enough, if he is not deserving this commitment of mine, he's not worthy. He's not worthy of being that person that I obey and therefore getting married to. And this is extremely important. Teach your daughters that when you want to choose the man that you want to marry, if he's not man enough, if he's not responsible enough, if he doesn't have a good history of being committed to his deen, romance is just gonna dissolve. It's nothing but a mirage. And therefore, the Prophet ﷺ emphasized that before you even get into recognizing your priorities, you need to recognize first that you want to put piety first. And that's why, remember that DNAIM that I was talking about earlier, right there, the DNAIM, exactly. That's that scrutiny that you want to apply. So when I talk about the husband being a responsibility, I need to check his deen, I need to check his life, I need to check his mind, I need to check his chastity, and I need to look at his wealth. Now I know that you will say, well, wait a minute, I thought you said I first and then before mind. Differences of opinions between scholars. Don't worry about it. We'll get there. Okay. So now we look at the most important thing, well, since we're going to be considering about the husband's deen first, I want you to look at his piety first before you even get married. Because if this man is not committed to his deen, then trust me, he's not going to be committed to you either. Simple as that. If he's not committed to Allah, why is he going to be committed to you? He's just going to be committed to himself. He's going to be committed to his own selfishness. If this person doesn't understand and does not submit to principle, does not submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's going to expect you to submit to him. And if you don't, that's when that narcissism personality will then come to the surface. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was teaching us, listen, or the Prophet ﷺ teaching us, إِذَا جَاءَكُمْ مَنْ تَرْضَوْنَ دِينَهُ وَخُلُقَهُ فَزَوِّجُوهُ. The first thing you want to look into a man is basically his deen. And that's the same thing for the man. The first thing you want to look into a woman is not how attractive she looks, but the first thing you want to look for is she committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That's the first thing. And that's why he said, فَاظْفَرْ بِذَاتِ الدِّينِ تَرِبَتْ يَدَاكَ. You want to be committed to a woman that has the deen, because that's the person that's going to give you that security. That's the person that you're going to trust. That's the person that's going to bring in that peace of mind. And you won't have to look again. That's why I said the worst thing in a relationship is lying and sneaking. Because once that person sneaks behind your back and then they create a narrative, and they're willing to create a religious narrative and commit something haram and say, well, I've got a halal reason to do it. And here's the religious label on how I can make this halal certified. And they'll create different ways. Shaitan will manipulate them and they'll make it halal certified. If she's giving a halal certification to uquq, or he's giving a halal certification for his uquq, that for his disrespect to parents, well, he'll be easily giving a certified label. Trust me, it's a lot easier to give a certified label to basically have uquq against the wife or the husband and just call them toxic, narcissist. That's what's happening today. And then give themselves the justification to basically use every card in order to get around and not apply the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so how do I support my husband's deen? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَيُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. Wait a minute, so am I supposed to support him or is he supposed to support me? Both. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that they are, the word is awliya. Yes, that woman is your wali too. Yes, that wife, your wife, yes, she's your wali. Wait a minute. How is she my wali? Yes, she's your wali because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. This is talking about al-mu'minuna wal-mu'minat. This is talking about the believing men and the believing women, that they are supporters of one another. Wait a minute, so that woman is going to be my wali? Is that what you're saying? Yes, I am. That's exactly what I'm saying. Because it's not the issue of gender. It's not the issue of male, female that is determining truth here. What is determining truth is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not your masculinity. And it's not her femininehood that determines truth. Truth is determined by Allah. And we both submit to Allah. So that's why he said, بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ. They would order for what is good, and they would forbid what is evil, and they would all, both male and female, they would believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, when you talk about obedience to the husband as being worship, I would obey you in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered as the parameter of obedience that is permissible. So the second you obey me to haram, that's when I'm going to say objection. You don't have the right to obey me, to order me and ask for my obedience when you order for what is haram. Because the parameter is supposed to be that we both work as vicegerents to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commandments. We both work towards that. And once any of us gets out of that border that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set, that's when me as a woman is responsible to tell you and remind you to get back on track. And you as a man, you basically have to get in and say, wait, my dear wife, I have a responsibility to get you back on track. And I want you to get back because I want you and I to be told, "Udkhulul jannata antum wa azwajukum tuhbarun." I want on Judgment Day that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would tell me, you and your wife enter Jannah together. Let's continue. Or actually, what we're going to do, wow, it's 11:57. So what we're going to do, I'm going to be taking questions in next, oh, well, not next week, but the day after tomorrow, inshallah, we're going to be continuing basically these different categories. So the day after tomorrow, inshallah. So let's say, is there another question right there? No. Okay, here we go. I thought all classes were on break until Sunday. Really? So I was supposed to be, oops. My bad. I guess I was just too enthusiastic. Yeah, there you go. All right. Allah musta'an. Yeah, my bad. If there are any questions, you can unmute yourselves and go ahead. Nobody has any questions? All right. I'm going to terminate.